Okay, I'm excited to introduce someone that probably most of you know very well, but I will introduce her.
That's kind of awkward.
Yes, well, but this is what's happening, and maybe not everybody knows all of this.
No, that's true. Yeah,
right?
True.
So this is Professor Vivienne Matthies-Boon, Socrates professor, actually, by a special appointment in Europe, Humanism, and Social Justice. She's also the head of our department, which is Ethics and Political Philosophy here at Radboud. And in addition, she leads the Ethics Network platform within the Post-COVID Network Netherlands. And her main interests are German, critical theory, and phenomenology, social and political violence, and how it relates to disability, chronic illness, ethics of care, and the philosophy of death. And her current work focuses on the experience of violence, trauma, and deadliness in patients, specifically post-COVID patients, but a whole, like, patients of chronic illnesses, right? Like ME, CFS. And in this context, we'll also hear her talk today, which is titled On the Violence of Psychologization of Post-Viral Illness, a Habermasian Solution, ? She'll speak for 35 minutes, and then we'll have a few additional speakers online who speak for another 10 minutes. And that is Dr. Fabian Fritz from Social Work in Leipzig.
Siegen.
Mirja Siegen.
Siegen.
Okay, yes. Then Mirja Nicolas from psychiatry or in psychiatry, but this time Leipzig, right? Yep. And Sonja Hannibal from applied mathematics, very interesting, and from Münster.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So thank you very much. It's kind of awkward because I can't see on my computer if people online are hearing this. I don't see anything at all, in fact, anymore. But okay, I'm just going to trust for now that the technology works. Otherwise, this thing will just be disrupted too much. Let me first of all start with the disclaimer that this was a last-minute jump in. And so with that comes the level of philosophical rigor that I would have, otherwise put in might be slightly less than one might expect or one might desire. At least that's how I personally feel about it. So that's kind of like a disclaimer, right?
Which is also why this is work in progress.
Exactly. It is very much work in progress. And that's also why the Habermasian thing is with a question mark, because that's also where I'd like some input, some thoughts, some critiques. So as Carmen already indicated, basically what I present today is part of a broader undertaking, one could say, on post-viral ethics, where I try and work on basically a mixture of a Habermasian discourse ethics together with a lived ethics, so a kind of an existential lived ethics, and see how those combine in terms of also a discursive framework. It also, of course, is in line with the work that I'm already doing with the PCNN, and then the project on deathliness in long COVID, which looks at living death, social death, and euthanasia, and a variety of different articles, one of which is also forthcoming with Fabian, Mirja, and Sonja, which is on Betroffenheit, so affectedness in the German journal Widerspruch. So first, I'm actually not talking about psychologization as such broadly in, on all terrains, but rather I'm talking about it specifically. I'm going to talk specifically about it in context of post-viral and post-infectious illnesses. And there, I first want to start with just explaining briefly what it is. What are we actually talking about here? Because I think that gives an indication as to why psychologization is actually also rather problematic. So I start with the latest one of the post-viral, post-infectious illnesses, which is long COVID, which is broadly defined as conditions that persist for more than 3 months after initial SARS-CoV-2 infections. And it entails a vast range of symptoms which vary in their severity and most commonly include basically completely crashing and debilitating fatigue. It's nothing like tiredness, but it's really like a complete destruction of any sense of energy. brain fog, chest pain, difficulty breathing, heart palpitations, tinnitus, earaches, gastrointestinal problems, headaches, hormonal disbalance, nerve pains, depression, anxiety, skin problems, hair loss, and as well as neurological issues of loss of taste and smell. Now, long COVID entails basically an immunological dysregulation that also intertwines with cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, endocrinological, hematological, and autonomic systems and more. It is a multisystemic disease that leaves patients severely disabled in often basically a housebound and bedbound state. Now, long COVID should be understood at basically but the latest in the series of PIEs. So PIEs are post-acute infection syndrome diseases, which include illnesses such as Q fever, chronic Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr virus, and much more, which are associated with mast cell activation syndrome, POTS, as well as MHCFS, so myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, with regards to the latter, MHCFS has been recognized also by the WHO as a serious neuroimmunological disease that can happen to anyone after infection, a viral or bacterial infection, regardless of age, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background. However, women, because of their slight alterations in their immune system, they're a bit more likely to actually get the illness. In the case of it's been more likely. In the case of very severe ME, patients are in constant pain and most in severe ME entirely bedridden. They have to lie in darkened rooms with eye patches on, earplugs in, as any sense of touch, light, smell, or any sensory input for that matter, exacerbates their physical situation, causing severe physical pain and what some have basically described as a sense of torture. Now, this relates to what is called post-exertional malaise, which is PEM. I hear people coming in. Could anyone go who's on the laptop into the Teams meeting and just admit people, because I can't do it from here whilst I'm talking. Thank you. I don't know who can do this, but I'm outsourcing the problem, basically. Thank you. This relates to post-exertional malaise, which is the severe and painful deterioration of their physical state several hours, but also days after the slightest cognitive, emotional, or sensory exertion, including sensory input. Patients also call it living death. And in order to give you an indication of what we're actually talking about, I'm just going to show you this video. Okay. What the issue is also with ME/TFS is that basically the severity of suffering appears to be so grave that it's almost, oh no, I don't want to start that again. I want to get to the, yeah, that it's also almost cast as unbelievable. And this we also see, it's basically, it's been approached in a sense through a politics also of psychologization, which we also see in popular comments such as it being a yuppie flu of those who do not want to work. So what we see in ME/TFS and PACE is that this politics of psychologization has actually been rife. And yet I think we also have to realize that ME/TFS and also in this case long COVID are not just problems for our existing, say, population or the existing patients, but rather that it's psychologization, but rather that it's also inherently tied to our future. I mean, at the moment there are estimated to be more than 400 million long COVID patients worldwide, 2.5 million of which in Germany alone. As the cases continue to rise, not only due to recurring COVID infection, which, by the way, every COVID infection increases your chance also of developing long COVID and makes the situation of people worse. Vaccinations don't protect sufficiently, etc. But also in light of climate change, we see an increase of zoonotic diseases, the 200-time-fold increase of ticks in Europe alone, which can very much lead to chronic Lyme disease, but also mosquito-transmitted diseases. So the ones that we have coming up or that are already here in an increasing rate are dengue, Zika, chikungunya, West Nile virus, yellow fever, St. Louis encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis, Rift Valley fever, malaria will be here in 2030, and all these kind of basic transmission-borne illnesses, they also have a severe or like a significant risk of these severe long-term consequences. And so maybe I'm revealing my age a little bit, but there always this advert in the UK when I was living there that they said, the future is bright, the future is orange. In this case, it always makes you think of, the future is dark, the future is post-viral or post-bacterial, to put it in those kind of slogan type things. Now, the problem is, as I said, that despite these risks and despite the level of suffering, bias has basically been regarded through the prism of psychologization. And that has been done through the psychosocial model. Now, the psychologization and through this BPS model basically starts with the work of George Engel in 1977, and particularly his essay, The Need for a New Medical Model, a Challenge for Biomedicine. Now, herein he critiques medicalization and proposes a holistic model of health and illness wherein the psychological and social components, in addition to the biomedical factors, ought to be recognized. So far, so good, one might say, right? Sounds nice. However, as we'll see later on, his model was conceptually so vague that it not only became epistemologically meaningless, but also left the door wide open to abusive practices. And this we see very clearly in the adaptation of his theoretical model, or what he thought was a new scientific model, but of his model by Munsell, Waddell, and Howard Aylward in the early 2000s. Waddell and Aylward worked as scientists for the British government and were set to task to lower the benefit payments by developing new eligibility criteria for disability benefits. So I determined whether someone was eligible for financial support or not. And they revised their BPS model, and that played basically the essential role in this criteria. And they proposed that we make a distinction between medically objectifiable disease and subjective illness experience that cannot be medically objectified. Or in English, they basically say it's medically unexplained symptoms. And in the Netherlands, we call it somatische onverklaarbare lichamelijke klachten. Now, in the case of medically unexplained complaints, they basically say that as the medical aspects cannot be verified or cannot be objectified, they're basically not there. Hence, they argue that medically unexplained symptoms, so the illness experience, is a self-created experience of illness that is not based in any sense of objective reality, and rather the psychosocial plays a much more dominant role in this than the medical situation of the person. But it's not only that they say that this self-created experience of illness is not based in objective reality, but rather they write that these patients are deliberately malingering. So that these are patients that do not have an objectifiable illness and are therefore malingering and should be regarded with suspicion, because basically they are out for illness gain, so looking for financial support and looking for social attention from other people. And so, in this aim for illness gains, what these patients do, they say, is that they sustain their illness behavior through negative thoughts and activity avoiding behavior. And so, in order to get these patients out of this subjective state of disease, they argue, we should move away from biomedical research, because that would basically, it's not only a reductionist biomedical model, according to them, but it would actually hold the patient's fake belief that they are in fact ill, so the patient's illusion intact, and you need to break through that. Secondly, they say there should be a reduction of social incentives. So we should reduce benefits, disability benefits or disability payments, because these payments and these structures basically perpetuate the laziness of these people. They basically don't want to get into action. And now this sounds all very wild, but actually if you read their work, it is actually there, and it is also fairly recent, which, I mean, I still find quite shocking, because it's 2005, 2010, and it has a huge influence on the whole field. Then thirdly, they say people should be enforced to do graded exercise therapy, so that they could be forced out of their laziness. And lastly, they should restructure their thoughts, and the thought that they are ill should be restructured through cognitive behavioral therapy, which would restructure your thinking. So patients should no longer think about their illness. And actually, if they're thinking about their illness, this is a sign of illness-sustaining thoughts, by which they're just obsessed with their illness, making themselves ill. Now, of course, one could say, there are a lot of ethical issues here, right? And I'll get to them in a second. But first, I think I want to get to the more underlying epistemological issues first, because there's often a quick jump test that may, certainly in the patient community, of like, this is just wrong. But actually, let's also just explore some of their assumptions and some of the problems, which has also been laid out in the literature. Firstly, the Aylward and Waddell BPS model suffers from a fundamental anti-scientific assumption, namely the assumption that our scientific or our medical knowledge is complete, and that all diseases can already be biomedically objectified. Now, this completely goes against any sense of scientific practice and knowledge, to the extent that we know that new discoveries are still being made. It's basically just bad science. Before MRI scans were there, the issues that were then maybe labeled as psychosocial or whatever, then also could be objectified. So it doesn't mean that, because we can't objectify it now, that there isn't an objectifiable cause. It's like that step is too easily made. Secondly, the BPS model, and also actually in Engel's work, does not provide clear definitions of the medical, social, and psychological components. Rather, it leaves a delineation of these aspects vague and arbitrary. With its three domains of social, psychological, and physical components of health, the model basically encompasses nothing less than the whole, basically whole human life as such. Anything can be put in. And given that these domains are also, with regards to illness, not clearly defined, it also fails to explain the connection between these poorly defined components. So it does not provide an explanatory theory or explanation properly of how these three underdefined key components interact in the composition of patients' health or illness. It only assumes that this is the case and then leaves it at that. And the problem is that thereby the BPS model cannot scientifically differentiate between cause and effect relations and false correlations. And as Ghani, Alford, and Roberts and others have argued, the BBS model just is based on assumptions of those who apply the model that are considered, when they consider something to be a social factual truth, even in the face of a clear lack of sufficient reasoning and evidence. So the lack of clear definitions and clear delineations of the biomedical, psychological and social factors, as well as a lack of a clear causal or correlative relation, basically leads to the possibility of arbitrary prioritizing one component instrumentally and obscuring the other components. And basically, it's within this sort of eclectic model that basically one of the three components can just be put to the fore, purely depending on the personal preferences, beliefs, or convictions of the person or institution applying the model. Thus, it's based on the assumed associations between variables rather than the solid causal evidence, and that's the problem. As Joanne Hunt also writes, the BPS model is thereby, it's quite clear actually that it's based on unproven assumptions. In other words, an arbitrary approach that is mainly driven by these biases and personal preferences. And it's therefore also that, for instance, Alex Roberts, but also McLaren and others argue that the BPS model is not so much a scientific model because it lacks explanatory capacity, but perhaps a conceptual model that has been wrongly used as a scientific explanatory model by its proponents. And McLaren goes even so far as to say, the BPS model as a scientific model just basically doesn't exist. Yet the issue here is that there is a popular but mistaken idea within medicine, particularly, or the psychosocial medicine, that the BPS model has been scientifically validated as such, and that it can define diseases and establish their causes, so that it can do this kind of causal explanatory work. Yet, as Roberts and Gami and others also explained, the success of the BPS model is in fact due to the fact that all empirical data fits into the BPS model, because it's all basically encompasses everything and is unfalsifiable. So it's like, hooray, whatever you put in, you always have success. You always have great papers to produce. You always have nice grants to, and support, and so et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, 3 languages in one there. And that's, so it rather forms a totalizing framework within which every form of suffering and even every aspect of life can be included in the BPS model. But also it's problematic because in the application of the model, it becomes immunized against critique. For instance, a patient who complains that I am really ill, physically ill, which, by the way, I'm not saying that, just to clarify, that those who experience psychological illness are not really ill and don't experience illness. That's not the point here. But when patients say there's something physically wrong with me, then the person applying the BPS model will very likely, this is what we've also seen in many cases, will basically say that, you see, you're holding on to your false illness beliefs. So it becomes immunized against critique. So it's not only that everything can be explained away from the BPS point of view, the medic and the researcher applying this model also becomes the authoritative voice. And it's through this monological constitution that discursive contestation and patient voices are also closed. Not only that, but those infectious patients that complain not only become regarded as difficult patients sustaining an illness-sustaining behavior, but are also actively, and we see this currently very much alive, but also actively depicted as polarizing, militant, and hysterical patients, in light of which the researcher, mostly those who are applying the BPS model, do not feel safe. We need to remember here, though, that these patients, as we've seen before in the video, are mostly house and bedbound patients. And so it's not surprising that the study, it's not there, sorry, that the study by Blees and Garrity into this has also shown that the militancy and polarization that patients are accused of actually isn't there. That rather patients are engaged in, what Habermas would call the positing of truth claims, often on social media because they have no other platform. Anything else is, and even that is often too taxing, wherein they basically call for biomedical research and a recognition of their physical suffering, pretty much in the same way as HIV actors did before them. So the thing of polarization in this context is often used as a discursive quip to discredit them. Now, why is the BPS model ethically problematic? It's ethically problematic in the sense that the epistemic injustice that the BPS model causes, I think, is clear for all to see, or should be. Within healthcare, epistemic injustice basically occurs when, for instance, patients' understanding and stories about their own conditions are not taken seriously, and are devalued. And thus, in epistemic injustice, patients are not taken seriously as equal interlocutors, so equal partners in debate. Their stories and testimonies are considered irrelevant, confused, over-emotional, useless, or too time-consuming. Or to put it in perhaps somewhat more Habermasian terms, their equal intersubjectivity is denied on the basis of their subjectivity, namely being a patient. Such epistemic injustice is, of course, related to testimonial injustice, in which a speaker, in this case the patients, basically suffers a credibility deficit in their capacity as being a knower due to prejudice. In the BPS model, the patient's experiences, knowledges, and insights are immediately pushed aside and are not taken seriously as knowers. Patients were told that they were not suffering from a real disease, but that from medically explained symptoms, and that they all made it up in their heads in search of illness gain. But also that they are too affected, too emotionally involved to be taken seriously as partners in debate. Now, such stigmatization, we also have to realize, has serious, is not just, so to speak, unpleasant in the medical exchange, but rather also has serious social and economic consequences, in addition to psychological harm, because it leads to the internalization of feelings of guilt, that one is guilty for the illness and one has somehow, through negative thoughts, through thinking about the illness, constructed one's own illness. And this contributes also significantly to the social misrecognition, to the depiction of NHCFS as a yuppie flu, as a psychological problem, etc., etc., and the basically ridiculization of such illnesses, which of course is terrible. The same way, also, by the way, that also the stigmatization of psychological illness, just to be clear here, is also terrible. So just I don't want to want to make sure that you know what I'm saying. But also seriously ill people were plunged, specifically after the latest modification to the model, directly into poverty because they're financially cut and receive fewer or no benefits at all because their illness is not real and they are malingering, they're making it up. Work was also promoted by Waddell and Aylward as something that is always beneficial to health. Some of which, it's like, yeah, anyway, let's just, it's one, if you read the book, honestly, it's like you will need like relaxation medication to get through it even. At least I do. It's just so terribly as a philosopher to read it, but anyway, it's painful. In addition, they also suggested that families and support group are a factor that keep the illness intact, in place, and encourages patients not to improve. This further contributes also to the patient's social isolation, whereby We often have also in the Netherlands, the veilig thuis, so the safe home, I don't know how you call it, like reports of children with pies illnesses from parents who were then accused of basically Munchausen by proxy because they did not want to subject their children to the cognitive behavioral therapy and the graded exercise therapy. And many more such cases. We also here, I think it's important to recognize and to know for us that BPS in the context of ME/CFS and post-acute infectious syndrome results also directly in the physical deterioration of illness. So it's not just unpleasant, it results in terrible physical consequences. This is due to PEM, which is what I already explained in the beginning, is this idea that if you have a small exertion, physical, emotional, cognitive, it leads to the further decline that may last days, weeks, months, or years, or maybe even stay like that forever. The problem is that in the context of BPS, that the graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy were proposed as treatments, whereby they would have to gradually increase their movements, so rather not take into account their energy envelope, but really actively go above it. And that if they were having pains, they were told to ignore the pains because those are false pains, they're not real pains. And so the patient was basically told not to listen to their body. And then if they did listen to their body, they were also being told that they were basically being psychologically obsessive with their illness. So again, it's also the psychological constraint, the psychological framing. They also had to be undone. Now, this was not only psychologically damaging, but also resulted in a structural deterioration of patients, even to the point of permanent bedriddenness and death. As patients were forced to exceed their exercise limit and they were forced into activation, their structural physical state deteriorated, but also many ME/CFS patients can also suffer when they're in a severe state of gastroparesis, which basically means that the bowels stop working and producing food. And instead of being offered TPV, which is like the treatment, that you basically get a thing in your stomach to get the food. It's denied because, and this is currently going on at the Radboud as well, Radboud UMC, because it's believed the illness is psychological. So currently at the Radboud, right next door to us here, we have Sonja van Enkelvoort, who's lying there with basically, she's currently starving to death because the TPV is being denied, although her other ME/CFS specialists should say that she has to have it. Because the doctors here in the Radboud UMC is actually one of the main centers in the Netherlands that really proposes this idea of ME/CFS as psychological and really advances its BPS model. And yeah, basically we know that when this treatment is denied, people die. And we've seen this also in May Buvie O'Neill in 2021, where the inquest also basically led to the conclusion that this was medical negligence based on biases and discrimination. But also even the milder ones, when they come into rehabilitation clinics in a milder form, and are then told to, exercise and think positively, they often leave in a wheelchair and become entirely bedbound. So and the problem here is that even when people do not physically die directly of their disease in the sense of, say, Maeve O'Neill and maybe now possibly Sonja, it also leads to a structural deterioration of illness by which basically a lot of people end up committing suicide. So if you're in this community, you see around 3 or 4 people committing suicide basically every week. They're kind of going after so many years of this. The other ethical problem caused by suicide. The other ethical problem caused by the BPS model is that the treatment has been, so biomedical treatment has also been hindered and delayed. And as a result, we still have to catch up. And that's because ME/CFS and PIES could be explained away psychologically, it was no longer necessary to do any more biomedical research. Yeah, I'm going to the end also. So it therefore leads also into this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy whereby, if you label it as psychological, you don't no longer need to have the alternative proof. And so you remain stuck in that kind of loop. Now, I do think and I do hope that with what is currently going on in terms of, biomedical research, that there are some movements pointing towards the other direction. There's at least plenty of evidence that it is not a psychological disease, but I'll leave that to the side for now. Now, what I wanted to get to you, and this is where I'm going to also close on, is basically the philosophical conundrum. Aside from all the the scientific objections, the ethical objections, I also am, in all honesty, undecided whether psychologization is an extension of the problem of medicalization as such, in that patients are only believed in something when it's medically objectified. And if not, then it becomes psychologized, so it's in a sense the extension, or whether it's still actually the opposite of medicalization through its fundamental denial of objective medical corporeality. I'm not entirely sure. I'm kind of struggling with this still yet. Either way, the only way that arguments will be heard is eventually through the biomedical verification, in pretty much the same way as it was with HIV. I also think that though the critique of medicalization was and is very valuable, it might just be one side of the story, and that whilst, for instance, the critique of medicalization as formulated by Foucault was very nuanced, it has since been flattened somewhat in its more popular social current forms, whereby medicine becomes basically depicted as something by definition as the big bad boogeyman, putting it rather academically nuanced here, but without a critical questioning of the ways in which this supposedly emancipatory critique of medicalization could actually also repeat what it criticizes, namely in that it doesn't take patient, or there's a danger in, as we've seen in these cases, that of not taking patients' voices, experiences seriously, and also reifying their and stigmatizing these experiences. Rather, this kind of subjectification or individualization of the problem is also the other side of the same coin of the objectification that we've seen in medicalization. And there's also a thing here that the BPS is perhaps a normative framework that is riddled in modernist mythology. That is imposed on patients, whereby it's a resilient patient that heralds the day, the resilient patients who manifest their autonomy and takes control of their lives through lifestyle management, positive thinking, movement, etc. And of course, here I also have to think of Eva Illouz's work on the therapeuticization of the self, but also Barbara Ehrenreich's profound critique of positive psychology and the emphasis on the positive, but also how in all of this somehow the existential confrontation with the vulnerable corporeality of suffering, or the suffering subject, is also lost from view. Here I also think, and then I'll get to the Habermasian, I'm going to cut some of this at the end. Here I also think that we also have to realize that with MHCFS, it's an illness, and PIEs, those are illnesses that one cannot fight their way out of through movement, through doing. Rather, actually, that makes you a hell of a lot worse. And so that also challenges some norms or some ideas, some modernist ideas of the self, and instead confronts us with a radical dependency, a chronic vulnerability, but also a radical intersubjective uncertainty, as it can affect anyone at any time. And also it hangs in between life and death. It's sort of like this living death. It also challenges modernist notions of medical differentiation as progress. Rather, it shows us that we have a systemic disease that actually requires, a systemic approach, whereby basically medical differentiation might work have negative effects in these cases. Now to come to the Habermas, what interests me here is the way in which the BPS proposal was founded on this notion of overcoming the mind-body dichotomy and the subject-object dichotomy. That's what Engel really wanted to get rid of. But the question I think here is whether it's not replicated what Habermas calls the philosophy of the subject, or the philosophy of consciousness. And the problem is that the BPS model relies on an arbitrary prioritization of the medical, social, and psychological components of illness perceived from within the confines of the internalized perspective, first patient perspective, in the sense that it becomes all internalized into the mind rather than, social structures, etc. So, or putting it rather more bluntly, the analysis remains stuck at a level of philosophical intentionality, namely the internalized view that the mental power of minds or mental states bring about certain state of affairs, and that it's this objectifying interpreter of this internal state of affairs, so the BPS researcher, that has this, undisputable interpretive power. And that is actually precisely what Habermas has criticized, not BPS researchers, but philosophers of doing. That's kind of why I'm thinking that Habermas's idea of the philosophy of the subject is kind of interesting. Then the last point I want to make, I'm going to do that more normally like this, is is that there's also a question of whether BPS does not basically made a category mistake, in that it reduced the medical, psychological, and social into the realm of what Habermas would call the subjective realm of validity. So the subjective realm of subjective truth. Are these people being serious? Are they being honest? And yet I wonder here if Habermas's distinction between validity spheres, so looking at objective truth, but also intersubjective norms and subjective sincerity, but then maybe changing the latter from sincerity away to experience, if a remodification could provide a way of looking at these kind of illnesses in a systemic, multi-leveled way, without replicating the stigmatization. So it wouldn't be a scientifically explanatory model, but it could maybe provide a model through which we would be able to look at the medical objective conditions of the illness, so the immunological changes, etc., but also the way in which intersubjective norms are being violated in terms of how patients suffer epistemic injustice, but also, say, a lack of social structures that could help them, lack of social solidarity that again would implode their thing, and that we need to take their experiences, so their subjective experience, very seriously. I'm well over time, so the last thing I wanted to just add to this is this, and that is that I think maybe also a starting point for my ex-UvA colleague, Afsoon Afsahi, whereby she argues that in Habermas we should perhaps in such cases not think about including the all affected and by establishing norms, but maybe looking at the most deeply affected, and maybe making sure that the most deeply affected would have an equal playing game in the discursive terrain. However, these are all unfinished thoughts, and I'm well over time, and I really hope that Fabian and others are there. Yo, and I also hope that they heard this.
I need to close this session.
Oh, I did this on here? Hey, Fabian. 1 second. I somehow. Yes. Cool. Could you hear everything what I just said?
I think most of us were in another talk because there were 2 links to 2 different.
Than the one that
so
I
I've yeah, so I think we stepped in after 20 minutes or something like that.
Okay. That's a shame. I'm sorry about that. So, but nevertheless, so basically what I think, so just to introduce Fabian to all of you. Fabian Fritz is an academic working in Siegen on Sozialarbeit. And we're working also together with Mirja, Nicolas, and Sonja, Hannibal. And we're basically having now sort of bi-weekly conversations around these topics. And I kind of thought that you should be exposed, not just on my philosophical arguments, but also with how these topics are discussed. So I was just wondering if you'd nevertheless would be, it's a bit awkward if, yeah, you missed a bit of talk. I'm sorry about that.
Just 10 minutes,
But
I think.
yeah.
Then it's all.
Oh, okay. But I was just wondering, yeah, if you would like to say something about, as we agreed on the kind of experiences as patients in the BPS model and psychosomatization.
Yeah, I can start. So thank you for the invitation. And yeah, so in social work, we discuss Habermas as, from a different angle. We use the communication philosophical way he described everything and the deliberative democracy thing. And I think that's also kind of mixing with, or we can see the BPS from this. So first, if we see his theory of system and life world, I probably would put the BPS model on the system side of how he describes society, because he thinks the life world of something that's deeply made up by communications and the search for solutions of daily problems. I mean, that's a very shortcut of the idea, and not a systematic way which is full of power and all of this. And I think the BPS is a tool of power in the way how Habermas would describe the system. So that could be one access. And the more important one is we use his communication philosophical way of deliberative democracy to describe how being affected is a power of knowledge. And I think that's totally neglected by the BPS model. So being affected becomes suspicious. So you are not, neutral. You are this and this, and we are the experts, and you are not. And Habermas would turn that around. He says that if there are decisions that affect you, that you deeply have to be heard about that. And that's not happening in the BPS at all, because in social work, we say, don't understand somebody better than the person itself that's kind of penetrating this person in their space. And that's basically the way how the BPS works. So I think that could be some additions how we can see the BPS from the Habermasian way. And yes, I, as a person being affected, so I was a professor before and lost that position because of long COVID. And I found it interesting how fast I became into psychosomatical clinic, where my whole position was deconstructed. So I was not seen as a scientist anymore. I was just a patient, and so I was stupid. So whatever I found out by myself about the illness was wrong. And like Vivienne said, it was like, oh, you're thinking that too much, but probably you are just young from East Germany, you're scared of your job. That's why you are ill now. It's nothing to do with the virus you just had a few months before. Yeah. And I hope Mirja and Sonja maybe can add something, or somebody want to reply. It's a little bit difficult. I only see black screen, so I don't know exactly what's going on.
Maybe I can change the setting a little bit. It's difficult on this. Is it together mode?
Or try together mode or speaker. And there's Sonja.
Okay, no, that's just weird. No, we're going.
Speaker mode.
Let's just.
We can do speaker mode.
Okay, let's just do that. That is really strange. Okay.
Can we always have this thing?
It looks fun, yeah. For us.
I'm going to go back to gallery. I'm sorry, I'm old-fashioned. I prefer less. Okay.
Yeah.
Sonja, would you like to add? Are you okay to add anything, or if not, that's also okay.
Yes, I would like to add something. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I have sadly a lot of experience on the receiving end of this psychosomatic treatment. And overall, it has been traumatizing for me. It is no help at all. And I don't think it has any value or validity to even be in the healthcare system. And I can describe a bit of my experience. I was in a psych ward, and I had severe ME/CFS at that time. That means I was mostly bedbound, and yeah, the treatment I got was mostly that people tried to force me to be more active, which at times meant that they would withheld food. I at one point went without food for 2 days in that hospital, and it also had so that was the physical component of the treatment. Basically, force you to do activity by any means, even if it means withholding basic needs. Sometimes they locked the toilet, sometimes they locked my room so I couldn't use the bed to rest. And then the psychological part of that is, as Fabian also already described, they basically try anything to assassinate your character. They try to find any explanation that makes remotely any sense to explain why you behave that way, on the assumption that you have a perfectly healthy body, which is just not the case. And on top of that, they try to gaslight you into believing that you actually have a healthy body, but you're just some shitty person throwing all those tantrums for whatever. It doesn't really make sense. So basically, I was in this environment of the psych ward, and it felt to me like they were trying to kill me. They forced activity on me that was way too much, and that would lead to permanent deterioration. So I was really stubborn, and I refused most of that. I had some people from out that helped me out. So I pretty much think that's why I even survived that. But it still left permanent damage on my health. And yeah, it basically feels like you have this whole institution that's trying to get rid of your lived reality, and in the same way, finally trying to get rid of you, trying to basically kill you, trying to do something that will in effect lead to you dying. That was what it was like to be in that institution as a severe ME/CFS patient. And I also observed how some of the nurses reacted to that, because this kind of treatment that was put upon me was mostly forced by upper level doctors that didn't have a lot to do with me. So I mostly dealt with the nurses, and I saw there was 2 ways to cope with this kind of split reality. My reality of being sick, and then this I cannot even call it model because it's just bullshit. This assumption that I was healthy, that was forced by the doctors. And some people tried to rationalize treating me like this by even telling me that my life wasn't even worth anything when I was like this, sick like this, and they could just it doesn't matter if they what they did to me meant that I was dying. And on the other hand, there were people who really despaired about the situation, and didn't want to deal with me anymore, and just I was trying. Just one nurse actually said to me, she was visibly upset, and she said she was just trying to help, but she kind of realized that that was not what's happening. So also I think, to sum it up, this whole BPS model it's just bullshit. It has no physical benefit, it has no psychological benefit for patients. It is mostly something that is a political instrument, it's meant to withhold medical care from a certain group of patients because they are probably pretty expensive to take care of. So you just make up all this bullshit to not have to put money in it, and kind of still have to, so you can still kind of keep up the appearance of caring for them, but you actually don't. And okay, that was most of my notes. Then I would give to Mirja.
I don't know if Mirja's there. I don't think Mirja's there, which is also understandable.
Yeah. Mia told me earlier that she was in the hospital today, so
Yeah.
she tried to take
It's okay.
part, but not.
It's
but
okay.
Am I allowed to add something for Sonja, to Sonja?
Yeah. And then
Yeah,
we'll
what
open
I
it to
also
the floor.
experienced. Yeah, sure. What I also find interesting is when I was in the university hospital of the university I used to work for in the psychosomatic ward, that the social worker there told me, I know that you are like dismissed here, and she gave me secretly an address where I should go. And that led to that I got an MRI of the heart later where they could definitely see the disease, because it was kind of it was a study which she recommended to me. And that I found that really like disturbing, that there are people working and knowing that we are scammed. So she said that happens to all the long COVID and ME/CFS patients that come to that ward, but she don't wanted me to like, talk about it there. But the interesting fact is still the documents from the psychosomatic ward are counting more than the MRI I got later, which explains everything, because they can see the inflammation of the heart and how the vessels don't work anymore, how they should. Doctors say that's too experimental. We don't do medicine with MREs. We think you are, it's all in your head. And your university hospital said that too. And they did no tests, nothing at all. They just said it's in your head, and they tested nothing. And yeah, that really disturbed me as a scientific person. And because I went in there with the trust, it's a university institution, they work like us, like I know it from science. We have different hypotheses and things like working together. And I learned that they only have one model and they use it for everything. And that disturbed me very much as a scientific person.
Yeah, I can really understand that. I see there's a question online, and after that question, I also want to open the floor here as well. So, Tom? Or was that just Tom?
Maybe didn't hear it. Tom?
If not, let's go back to Tom later. Are there any questions from, I'd say first in the room here for a second, and then I'm going to move online. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts to any of three of us?
General, so I don't know much about the biopsychosocial model, but from what I'm hearing from you, there's been a kind of paradigm shift in healthcare towards this model in the 1970s.
Yeah.
So my question is a little bit not so much about the particular case of these post-viral diseases, but the connection. So what was it like before? What was the paradigm before this, and how did it relate these types of systemic diseases that are not easily visualized, quantified, objectified?
Yeah.
What were the alternatives?
So I'm not sure that you can also properly hear it over there. So I just want to repeat the question just to be sure that you guys also hear it. It's basically a question about, the paradigm shift towards the BPS model, and what was there, before this in terms of, say, alternatives, or how did that paradigm shift occur?
And how were post-viral diseases approached in the previous paradigm?
And how were post-viral illnesses approached in the previous paradigm? So I think actually, and this is where we would more have to relate to the work by Paula Moore, who is also someone I'm working with and from Berlin. Actually, what you see is that the model has been intensified, so to speak. Rather than that there's been a paradigm shift, it's an intensification in a sense since the 1970s of this kind of approach. And before the Engels system and certainly Waddell and Aylward, you basically had the classification of these illnesses as neurological, sort of functional neurological disorders, which basically meant that they were classified in terms of Freud's hysteria thesis. So his idea that, this is just hysteria. And also when you look at Freud's classification of hysteria, you can really see also the parallels to actually ME/CFS patients. This was then also became very much sexualized in the sense that, this hysteria had to do with the room that was flying around the place and those kind of things. Paula is much more trained on this, so I'm kind of repeating a little bit of the kind of stuff that she does. But so what you see is not so much like a paradigm shift, but an intensification from these psychoanalytical insights, but then really applied to the biopsychosocial model. And this intensification, I think, is also at the same time interesting because it started to occur. 1977 is Engel. In 1980, we had is there someone?
Yeah, Sonja. Sonja, could you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
It's interesting in 1977 because in 1980, we had in psychology the shift from psychoanalysis to the cognitive behavioral therapy. So in a sense, what you then also saw is like that's when it became formalized. The DSM became basically this idea that it had to be cognitive behavioral therapy based on mathematical reasoning and no longer this, and a psychoanalytic approach, which, basically costs too much money. Putting this long story, complicated story, very blunt here. And then you saw that basically Engel and that started to oppose the medical system in a sense as their, and so relate to that as a reference rather than the psychoanalytical model. So that's when you see that the critique of medicalization then also comes in, and then he starts to oppose it to that, but applying the cognitive behavioral side. So it's a kind of a complicated story of how it relates to that. But the earlier, to put it very bluntly, the earlier versions were basically the psychoanalytical versions of hysteria. That's what it comes down to.
HIV went through the same process, so this DPS model was applied to it.
And HIV was, in a sense, also had the same kind of the same kind of application, but was less to do with cognitive structuring, but to do with homosexuality still being a disease. And so the social stigmatization was also tied to the homosexuality in that time also still being labeled as being an objective psychological disease or being a disorder. And it came much more from that angle. So, but it was the same, and even now to this day, there's even now, I mean, they're not in sort of the mainstream medical journals, but even now there's basically papers saying that HIV is psychosomatic, which is like, I find completely, it's like talking to flat earthers. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's really.
But that's not the mainstream. Why do I ask this? Because, I mean, of course, when you look at the HIV and the tradition around AIDS HIV and what happened there with ACT UP and everything, they did something very successful. Right?
Yeah.
So they succeeded in breaking free from this model.
Yeah.
And what is it that they did which these other post-viral illnesses need to succeed in doing? And I think it just has to do with, this is why I'm surprised by Fritz's story of bringing an MRI and saying, here it is. Now this fits into your biomedical model. So we can start talking about biomedical
True. I think in the end, the biomedical model in that sense will sort of reign the day or like, made a change. But what we also see, and this is where you get that loop constantly. So even if you have, say also in my case, right, I have severe immunological abnormalities that are objectified, like BT cells, NK cells, whatever, you name it. However, if you present that to a psychosomatic doctor who applies the BPS model, then they say, yeah, but you have those because you're stressed about your work. It becomes like an interpretive loop that despite the biomedical evidence becomes very difficult to get out of.
It's typical pseudoscientific reaction.
Yeah.
Fabian also wanted to comment.
Yeah, Fabian.
Yeah, I also came across that question for myself, and I noticed that maybe by looking on where the biopsychological model wants to go, we know a little bit more about its origin. So I did a little bit research on the latest European conference or worldwide conference, I'm not sure about that, but the latest big conference in Munich about the BPSM or psychosomatics, and there they introduce something new. They want to expand it to the bio, psychological, social, and spiritual model. And I think that's some backlash to what we had before. I think a lot of them misinterpret the autonomous nervous system as the soul, and there it becomes spiritual. And that's the whole purpose to when everything became like too scientific. That was a good model to rescue this idea of spirit, maybe of religion, of God or whatever, into the medicine. And I think that's where it came from, and there where it wants to go back to. And I want to add to Vivienne, I also found it interesting that when I had the MRI, the psychosomatic people said, yeah, see how powerful your spirit or your soul is. It can even modify your body in a bad way. You have this inflammation because it's all in your head and you want to be sick. And if you don't stop it now, you can even get cancer. And I was really shocked about that, because if you turn that whole thing, like I looked at that conference and they are like, there was one major talk and it says why the medicine is not 100% BPSM and what can we do about it. And I think that's how they see their model. Like we can explain every illness. If you look at books of them, they even tell you how a broken leg is like you struggled in life, then you fall because you have a problem and that's why you broke your leg. It's not like it was an accident. They explained it, everything in that model, and that makes it very, like, it reminds me to anthroposophics or this kind of sects where you have something where you can explain the whole world, and because it's so, I don't know the English word, but it's like it can soak everything in. It's like a sponge.
Yeah. We have Sonja, and then I think Carmen also wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I think Sonja was first.
Sonja?
Yes, and another reason why we might have this BPM model is recently there was a pepper spray attack at an airport, and then the BPS brigade came and declared it to be a mass hysteria. And this kind of stuff is historically related with MECFS and also with MECFS outbreaks, where, for example, there was one MECF outbreak at Lake Tahoe. It was correlated to environmental toxins and mold. And it caused basically a panic in that area, like because people kind of knew it was environmental, people didn't want to come to that town anymore. So the town, who was sustaining on tourism, pretty much lost its income. So they had to invent something to smoothen it out, to have people come back.
Yeah, and I think that just before we get to Carmen and that, I think that's also an issue, right? As in, like, this is also what we see in even with the case of long COVID, whereby the BPS model is also used to try and say, well, you see, it's these people's individual fault. Therefore, you no longer have to be afraid of potential risks and whatever. That's at least also, it's part of this, in a sense, immunization against, risk. Yeah, and Chrissy.
Yeah, I find it quite striking. And of course, it's like nothing new, but it's always when you kind of listen to people's life experiences and what they experience in the system, this kind of distinction between life, world, and system. What strikes me really is that there's a form of science denial in science that is quite structural, right? Where you find all the typical, like you mentioned, all of the typical elements of it, right? That it's not falsifiable, that it's immunizing itself against critique, that it kind of posits a form of self-fulfilling prophecy, et cetera, et cetera. And often it's kind of a response also to something that they cannot handle, right? And in a way that might be the problem also with HIV. HIV actually managed to get a lot of funding together and somehow turn this into a disease that can be conquered, right? So here it seems like the system is not doesn't doesn't have that response available. So rather it turns to a form of anthroposophism in a way, right?
Yeah.
So that brings me to your research questions and how to approach this, because I'm not sure. So why I see the point with, Habermas's focus on the philosophy of the subject and the problem of the modernist subject, of course, it has also been done by a lot of other thinkers like Foucault and also Taylor, right? The philosophy of the self. And here, I just don't know whether this distinction between psychologization and the medical system works, because if you look at, and you just, in your response to Tamar, right? It's very interesting, the history of psychology itself and anti-psychiatry, the anti-psychiatry movement, and what happened with that, right? And how much it had to struggle to actually look at the life world and not be in the system. I think medicine shares a lot with psychology and with the history of psychology. So I don't know whether, your question of whether it's a psychologization, whether that's whether psychologization is an extension of medicalization or its opposite. I don't know whether one can put it this way. I'm not sure, because it feels like the issue is more along the lines of system versus life world, and where the question is also, okay, because you do hold on to, and you too, right? There's objective truth, there's intersubjective norms, and then there's the subjective sincerity. So there is a sense of rationality, right? That is not the kind of rationalization that the system does. What is that? And how could we kind of maybe conceptualize that in a way that brings it maybe closer to what happened with HIV and other diseases that then were declared, conquerable? And I don't know. Yeah. But it's just a few thoughts.
Yeah, no, but they're good thoughts. And I also, one of the things I didn't mention as well is that, of course, there's this whole literature also of the phenomenology of illness, which would also is actually more focused on this life world.
And which is also closer to Taylor than it's more of a Taylor. Yeah, that's his kind of focus on the self and his critique of the modern self.
True.
Yeah.
Which is true. And now we do miss it now. Anyway, I do follow you on that one. Except that what I struggle with and I don't know if Fabian would agree with me on this, is that in patient struggles, in the recognition for the illness, there are real claims as a claim to factual truth finding, right? There is a claim, and so how do you, what I guess I miss sometimes in this phenomenology of illness, which would tie in much more to the life world, is that then it just all becomes an issue of subjective experiences again,
right?
And we kind of miss out those important political claims and those levels of contestation that are really extremely important for the patient. That's
the sincerity right there, and that would be great to include it there. Yeah.
So, but I will take your point on board. This is what I said. I also need to think more about this. This was like not worked out. I first have Bert here in the room, and then Tom online.
Your subtitle is
question mark.
I saw the but that it tells us that is what you work towards. Let's say I see the beginning of a Habermasian analysis. And it's involved coming to an analysis and think about the to that. But do you also pick this particular social philosopher because you expect kind of a sketch of a solution? That would tell us how to better deal with this.
Yeah,
beginning of kind of a normative account of how we could relate to it in a more positive sense.
yeah, and that, yes. And that's the bit that is still very much like, I mean, I wouldn't even call it that the stones on, there's no foundation yet. I mean, like, I mean, I'm not even laying the foundation yet. It's like it's but that comes out of the context of the post-COVID network that I'm involved in, where these issues are really playing up extremely violently, almost one could say, like discursively violently, where also patients ended up leaving, where patients are being stigmatized, and all sorts of things are going on. And it was sort of trying to think, could we use Habermas's different validity spheres and his, basically his discourse ethics, and develop a model of working better within that PCNN context. But that work I still need. So first I had to do the analysis and say, okay, what's going on here actually in terms of the system? Why are we falling over each other? What is the logical construction of this system? And then, I basically didn't get to do the further steps, which I think would be more interesting, at least for me philosophically. I'm not sure if it would succeed, if I'm honest. I mean, maybe it is just the analysis, but it would be nice if we could work towards something of a solution, or maybe not a full solution, but at least some positive formulation. Because the problem is that otherwise you always get this thing of like, oh, you're just critique. Yeah, okay. I mean, and partly you could say, yeah, that's our job as a philosopher, right? It's always open questions to negate in a sense. But I also would like to see, is there another way possible? But that I do need to still work out.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
This has to do this. No. Thanks. Yeah, I get that.
Tom? And then we
I
have
hope you
Sophie.
guys can hear me now. Can you?
Yeah, can hear you.
Great. All right. Yeah, I couldn't unmute my microphone earlier. Sorry for that. So I missed something. I missed some of the conversation and the discussion, but still, I also wanted to add 2 or 3 things.
Tom,
fir-
could I
first
interrupt
thing-
you briefly?
Oh.
Could you just maybe tell the room here a little bit about your professional
Oh,
background?
sure. Sorry.
Because
I just woke up. So, so my name is Tom. I'm a psychiatrist and long COVID patient, and I've also been working with Vivienne in the PCN network a bit, more on the medical side, but also a little bit on the ethical side. I always try to tell her that she's been quite ambitious in trying to propose a new model for BPS, which kind of has permeated the entirety of medicine for the last, let's say, 50 years or so. So I like the ambition, but I always also have to tone her down a little bit. But anyway, I heard a few things that spiked my interest. The first thing was you said that TPV or TPN, total parenteral nutrition, is a way that people are fed through the stomach. That's not true. People get the food into the blood. That's just a
the
medical.
blood. Okay.
Yes, that's just a medical difference.
Good.
So that the gastric tube doesn't work anymore, and that's why they get it into the blood normally. But people get denied this. That's the problem. At least now also in the Radboud. So a little correction there. Second thing, what I also heard Fabian and Sonja say, I've been spending a lot of time in Germany now also, Düsseldorf, Berlin. And what I see is a lot of cultural differences also in interpretation of the BPS. BPS really is, like you say, so badly delineated, it can be anything and nothing at the same time. So also in psychosomatic traditions, I see kind of cultural differences between, let's say, Germany, France, or in my case, in the Netherlands, right? And they're, at least in my country, quite niche, niche topics within my professional psychiatry that have kind of dominated this field of unexplained symptoms. So I don't want to overcomplicate things, but the hard thing is this makes things even more complicated because the idea of medically unexplained symptoms is being toned down a little bit in certain countries. they're calling them like functional disorders, and now they're not acknowledging the biomedical side. They're just saying that their side is also very important. So they're diluting and toning down their message a little bit, but they're generalizing it too, and I think that's very dangerous. It makes things even more complicated, and I really don't know how to tackle that. Lastly, I wanted to say that I really recognize what Fabian said when he said that recently this psychosomatic conference happened in Munich, and that they're trying to incorporate, let's say, this religious perspective or sentiment too, right? Which really doesn't surprise me, because these people have to keep moving along to remain relevant also, right? It's just an academic incentive they have that I think they're not really that conscious of. And it didn't surprise me, because I think that in the way that some of the BPS arguments, and I'm generalizing now because I think there's a lot of nuance in interpreting that, but why, at least in how these people interpret BPS, already is quite cultesque, already is quite religious-like, right? So it's not only circular reasoning. I think that as a philosopher, it's going to be very hard to find a rational reason why people use irrational arguments to explain irrationality in the body, right? To me, that's a conundrum too.
Yeah.
And I doubt there's just one rational explanation or one rational paradigm to explain that irrationality paradigm.
Yeah.
So those were my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a comment here in the chat that I'm just going to read, because the person would like to just kind of have someone read it. It's a thought on reframing accidents as psychosocial events. Quote, I think we also need to have a look at the intersection of the BPS model and insurance medicine. It is very often used to deny insurance claims because they frame the cause of symptoms as pre-existing psychological factors.
Yeah. Important point. Yeah. Fabian, you have your hand up? And I think you're the last one, because
there's one more. Maybe we can do.
Okay, we can do both. Fabian first.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to add something to Tom, because I think it's not only something that we have different approaches or like views in different countries. It's also a thing of different disciplines and science. So I'm, for example, coming from social work, it's like you can't be a professor or an expert without having spent time in the field. And here